What if one of the most disturbing performances in modern cinema wasn't just acting, but something that slowly took over real life? When people talk about Black Swan, they usually focus on its haunting atmosphere, its hypnotic descent into madness, and that unforgettable transformation that feels almost too real to be scripted. But what if the real story, the one behind the camera, is just as intense, just as obsessive, and maybe even more unsettling than the film itself? This isn't just another behind-the-scenes breakdown. This is where method acting, psychological immersion, and artistic obsession start to blur into something far more dangerous. Because in the world of psychological thrillers, especially one directed by Darren Aronofsky, realism isn't just encouraged, it's demanded. And sometimes, that demand comes at a cost. At the center of it all is Natalie Portman, delivering what many consider a career-defining performance. But performances like that don't just happen. They are built, layer by layer, through discipline, sacrifice, and, in some cases, a level of physical and emotional commitment that pushes the human body to its edge. Extreme weight loss, relentless ballet training, isolation, exhaustion. This wasn't preparation in the traditional sense. It was transformation. And that's where things start to get uncomfortable. Because the deeper you go into the making of Black Swan, the more you realize this wasn't just about portraying obsession. It was about creating it, not only within the character, but within the actor. The lines between Nina, the fragile ballerina spiraling toward perfection, and the person playing her, begin to dissolve in ways that are hard to ignore. And when that happens, a question starts to emerge. How much of what we see on screen is performance, and how much of it is real? But Natalie Portman wasn't alone in this psychological landscape. Surrounding her was an environment carefully constructed to amplify tension, rivalry, and emotional instability. Co-stars, dynamics, direction choices, all of it feeding into a system designed to extract authenticity at any cost. And while that may sound like the perfect formula for cinematic brilliance, it also opens the door to something far more complex and far more human. Because behind every frame of perfection, there's a story of pressure. Behind every moment of beauty, there may be discomfort. And behind every award-winning performance, there might be a process that no one fully sees or fully understands. And as we start peeling back the layers of what really happened during the filming of Black Swan, one thing becomes clear. The obsession didn't start on screen. It was already there, quietly shaping everything from the very beginning. And maybe that's why this story hits differently. Because even if you've never stepped onto a stage, never trained your body to exhaustion, never chased perfection to the point of breaking, there's something in this that feels familiar. That quiet pressure to be flawless. That internal voice that says you're not enough yet. That need to become something more, even if it costs you a part of who you are. So before we go deeper into what really happened behind the scenes of Black Swan, take a second and check in with yourself. Have you ever felt that kind of pressure? That need to prove something, not to the world, but to yourself? If this already resonates with you, leave a like on the video. It might seem simple, but it tells the algorithm, and me, that this kind of deeper, psychological storytelling is worth exploring. And I'm genuinely curious about your experience. Comment down below. Have you ever pushed yourself so far in pursuit of something that it started to feel consuming? Not just challenging, but almost like it was taking something from you? I read every comment, and these conversations often go way deeper than the video itself. And if you're new here, this channel is all about uncovering the hidden layers behind films, the psychology, the symbolism, the uncomfortable truths that most people overlook. So if that's your kind of journey, consider subscribing. Because what we're about to uncover isn't just about cinema. It's about the thin line between performance and reality. And that line, as it turns out, is much more fragile than it seems. There's something unsettling about realizing that the obsession you saw on screen didn't begin with the character. It began long before the cameras ever started rolling. Because when Natalie Portman said yes to Black Swan, she wasn't just accepting a role in a psychological thriller. She was stepping into a process that would slowly reshape her body, her routine, and, in subtle ways, her own perception of reality. At first, it looked like dedication, the kind of commitment we're used to praising in cinema. Months of ballet training, up to 8 hours a day, pushing her body into a discipline that usually takes years to master. Bruised feet, bleeding toes, muscles constantly on the edge of collapse. And alongside that, a strict diet that led to significant weight loss. Because the aesthetic of fragility wasn't optional, it was essential to the storytelling. This is where method acting stops being just a technique and starts becoming something closer to transformation. But here's where the tone shifts. Because this wasn't just about learning choreography or building physical endurance. The entire process was designed to create a state of vulnerability. Fatigue wasn't avoided, it was cultivated. Isolation wasn't a side effect, it was part of the immersion. And under the direction of Darren Aronofsky, that vulnerability became a tool. A way to strip away the layers between actor and character until what remained felt raw, unstable, real. And when your body is exhausted, when your mind is constantly focused on precision, perfection, repetition, something starts to happen. Your defenses lower. Your emotions become more immediate, less filtered. The line between performance and genuine feeling begins to blur, almost without you noticing. That's what makes psychological immersion so powerful, and at the same time, so dangerous. Because Nina, the character, is defined by her obsession with perfection. Her need to control every movement, every expression, every part of herself. And as Natalie moved deeper into that mindset, living inside that rhythm day after day, it wasn't just about portraying obsession anymore. It was about experiencing it, feeling it, letting it take space. And maybe that's the part most people don't see when they watch a performance like this. We see the final result, the elegance, the tension, the emotional breakdowns that feel so convincing they almost make us uncomfortable. But we rarely stop to think about what it takes to reach that point. What has to be sacrificed? What has to be pushed aside? Because perfection, especially in stories like this, isn't something you gently approach. It's something that demands intensity. It demands repetition. It demands a kind of focus that can slowly close off everything else around you. And the more Natalie surrendered to that process, the more the environment around her began to reinforce it. The expectations, the pressure, the constant pursuit of something just out of reach. And that's when the experience started to move beyond individual preparation and into something much more complex, something that involved not just her, but the people around her, the dynamics on set, and the psychological atmosphere being carefully constructed behind the scenes. If this idea of chasing perfection at any cost resonates with you, even in a small way, you can drop the word control in the comments. Just that one word, because sometimes that's where it all begins. And once that sense of control starts slipping, something else quietly takes its place. Because what was happening on set wasn't just about one actress pushing herself to the limit. The entire environment around Black Swan was carefully shaped to amplify tension, to blur emotional boundaries, and to create a kind of psychological pressure that mirrored the story itself. And this is where things become less about preparation and more about manipulation. At the center of that dynamic was the relationship between Natalie Portman and Mila Kunis. On screen, their characters are locked in a subtle but escalating rivalry, one representing control and perfection, the other embodying freedom and chaos. But behind the scenes, there are strong indications that this tension wasn't entirely fictional. Reports suggest that Darren Aronofsky intentionally avoided encouraging closeness between them, keeping a certain emotional distance alive to preserve that edge, that unpredictability. Think about that for a second. Instead of building comfort and trust between actors, as is common in many productions, the direction here leaned into separation, into contrast, into a quiet kind of friction that could be felt, even if it wasn't openly discussed. And when you combine that with the physical exhaustion, the mental pressure, and the constant demand for emotional authenticity, you start to create a space where reactions become less controlled, more instinctive. And that's exactly where the performances begin to feel disturbingly real. Because when two actors aren't fully grounded in a sense of safety with each other, every interaction carries a subtle tension, a hesitation, a layer of unpredictability that no script can truly replicate. And in a psychological thriller built on identity, duality, and emotional fragmentation, that kind of tension becomes cinematic gold. But it comes at a cost. The famous intimate scene between Portman and Kunis, for example, has often been talked about in terms of its impact on the narrative, but rarely do people explore the discomfort surrounding its execution. Both actresses have mentioned the awkwardness, the vulnerability, the strange emotional space required to perform something so exposed while already operating under intense psychological pressure. It wasn't just acting. It was navigating a moment where personal boundaries and character demands overlapped in complex ways. And the more you look into it, the more you start to notice a pattern. Small decisions, subtle choices, a direction style that doesn't just guide performances, but actively shapes the emotional reality of the actors. Not in an aggressive or obvious way, but in a controlled, almost invisible manner. Creating conditions instead of commands, letting the environment do the work. And this raises a question that sits right at the core of everything we're exploring here. When does directing cross the line into emotional engineering? When does the pursuit of authenticity begin to justify discomfort, isolation, even psychological strain? Because from the outside, it all leads to brilliance. Award-winning performances, critical acclaim, a film that stays with you long after it ends. But from the inside, the experience might feel very different. If this idea of emotional tension being used as a creative tool makes you think of any moment in your own life where distance, silence, or pressure shaped the way you felt, comment the word tension down below. Sometimes, just naming it already changes how we see it. And as this atmosphere deepened on set, as the boundaries between character and reality became thinner and thinner, something else began to emerge, something that didn't stay confined to the dynamics between actors, but started to affect what happened after the cameras stopped rolling in ways that most people never hear about. And that's when the story stops being just about what happened on set and starts becoming about what stayed with them after it was all over. Because when a project like Black Swan pushes so deeply into psychological immersion, it doesn't simply switch off when the director calls cut. The body might leave the stage, the costume might come off, but the internal state that was built over months of pressure, repetition, and emotional exposure doesn't just disappear. It lingers, quietly, sometimes in ways that are hard to even articulate. For Natalie Portman, this role became more than a performance. It became an experience that demanded total surrender. And while that level of commitment is often celebrated in cinema, there's a side of it that raises uncomfortable questions. Because to reach that level of authenticity, she didn't just simulate fragility, she lived inside it. Physically depleted, mentally focused to an extreme, emotionally open in a way that left very little room for distance between herself and Mila. And when you spend that much time in a state of controlled instability, something shifts. There are accounts of how deeply the role affected her routine, her mindset, even her sense of identity during that period. Not in a dramatic, sensationalized way, but in subtle distortions. The kind that make you feel slightly disconnected, slightly altered, as if part of you is still responding to a reality that no longer exists. That's the paradox of method acting taken to its edge. The more real it becomes, the harder it is to fully step away from it. And yet, from the outside, everything points to success, critical acclaim, industry recognition, and of course, the Academy Award that solidified the performance as one of the most iconic in modern psychological thriller history. But that leads us to a question that doesn't have a simple answer. When we praise a performance like this, what exactly are we celebrating? The talent? The discipline? Or the willingness to endure something deeper, more demanding, and potentially more damaging in the pursuit of artistic perfection? Because perfection in Black Swan isn't just a theme, it's a force. It consumes, it isolates, it demands everything. And the unsettling part is realizing that the film didn't just portray that idea, it echoed it in the way it was made. And maybe that's why it resonates so strongly. Because even outside of cinema, this pattern exists. The pressure to become flawless. The idea that to reach your highest version, you have to sacrifice comfort, balance, sometimes even yourself. And the more we look at stories like this, the more we start to question where that line really is, where dedication ends and self-destruction begins. If this reflection stayed with you, comment the word perfection down below, just that word, because sometimes naming the thing we chase is the first step to understanding it. And now that you've seen what it took behind the scenes, the next time you watch this film, it won't feel quite the same, because you won't just be watching a character fall apart. You'll be watching how close reality came to following the same path.